What's up, everybody? Welcome back. This is episode 40. We made it to 40. Today, we feature, I wrote down Mark Sarmel, but you came in and logged in as Mark Moreno on your Zoom name tag, who's an artist who actually I've never met before. This is the first time we're chatting. We met the other day on Clubhouse, and he reached out of trying to get onto the pod, and I looked him up, and I'm like, yeah, definitely. His work is speaking volumes for him. But here we have the opportunity to actually hear him share some stories and provide context to everybody. So thanks for joining us, Mark.
Hey, yeah. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, David.
Totally. So where are you today? How long have you been wherever you are? Are you a nomad or are you stationary?
No, I am stationary. I tell everybody I'm in Detroit, Michigan, but I actually live in a little suburb called Ferndale, which is just about 15 minutes outside of Detroit. But saying Detroit's a lot quicker and easier than explaining where and what Ferndale is. So roughly Detroit, by way of Las Vegas, by way of Texas. I was born in Texas in San Antonio. I grew up in Houston. I moved around a lot, spent some time in Austin. Got family all over. And I spent a couple years in Las Vegas. And then I moved up to Detroit in 2000. So I've been here since 2000.
Okay, so you've been there for a minute.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a heavy dose of time in Texas. Is that, talk about your childhood. Obviously, you're an artist and you're a creator, but, were you always doing that from the get-go, or kind of what were some of your hobbies or passions? Are your parents artists? Kind of where did you stimulate your creativity?
Yeah, I was an only child. My parents got divorced really young, so I spent a lot of time on my own by myself. And things that were keeping me occupied at that time were comic books. I loved comic books, so I was always drawing and trying to copy, Spider-Man and Hulk and Captain America and all that stuff. So Spider-Man was always my favorite hero. So that's kind of where the drawing bug, I think, came from in terms of like external inspiration. But my mom always drew. I have these like memories of her kind of just doodling while she'd be talking on the phone to someone or whatever. So that's probably where I got my talent from. And then it was just something I always did throughout my life and kept up with. And I think every like school has that kid or a few kids that draw. So I was always one of those kids.
You were that kid.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing? I think about this a lot. Like back then, like when the kids were, you mentioned tracing, right? And, even if you were a really good tracer, like you'd get some negative flag, or at least I did, of like, oh, you just trace things. So like, it's not really talented. But I feel like everybody needed to build up that foundation to actually like learn how to do it by themselves eventually. But it was really just like a stepping stone.
Yeah. I used to teach in illustration. So I went to the College for Creative Studies here, graduated many years ago, and I've gone back to teach now and then. But, tracing's a crucial skill. That's some muscle memory that you pick up. And sometimes you need to like trace something to see it in a line form. So you can kind of really look at it and understand, what's happening there. So tracing's pretty crucial. And, even especially for kids, like sometimes you just can't get that Donald Duck beak right. So you just got to trace
exactly
what it is.
That's right. Yeah, no, I definitely think it gets like a negative reputation, but it's super critical, as creatives. And then you mentioned a stint in Vegas, which is something super unique. I don't think I've had anyone who's shared experiences of Vegas. Were you living there, or were you just partying for a long time?
I was there for a couple of years, and it was kind of, partying, the partying I could do. It's kind of it's an expensive city. Even back then it was. But yeah, I had just followed a girlfriend up there, and they had family there. So we were just there, spending time with family, hanging out. We lived in a small suburb called Henderson. So we weren't actually in Vegas, but Henderson's like 5 minutes outside of Vegas. So
Gotcha.
It was a strange city. It's weird. It was hard to make friends there. It took me a long, long time to make friends. I was working for Kinko's, which is now FedEx office. So I spent a lot of time just, hanging out with all the weirdos at Kinko's that worked there, and then the weirdos that came in too, and lots of dudes coming in 6 a.m. in the morning, all disheveled and hungover, trying to get their presentation printed out for their big meeting.
And you were the guy that had to deal with that?
Yeah, yeah.
So you weren't doing art back then, or was it not like a full-time thing, or kind of how do you contextualize that in terms of your career?
Yeah, I mean, I was doing art. I wasn't really raised up where like art was sort of presented to you as a career option. It was always a sort of like nice thing I did. It was a hobby. It was something cool, but there was all, you were gonna have to do something else to make money and to live. So, I was young when I was in Vegas. I think I was like 21, 22, maybe 23, maybe. And just not, just young. I'd taken a couple of years of college, but wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, so I took some time off, which stretched into, more time off. And then, I'm super into comics. So I was trying to break into comics and trying to draw comics and things back then. And then when I moved to Detroit, then I was like, I gotta get my shit together. And so that's when I decided to get back to school, and I went to the College for Creative Studies here, and then I majored in illustration and minored in graphic design.
Nice. So after you graduated, did you actually get a job in illustration or in graphics?
No, I still don't have a job in illustration or fine arts, even though that's what I'd like to be in. I ended up getting a full-time job in advertising.
Okay.
So I've been doing that for many years, and it can be grueling work, but it's a lot of fun. You meet a lot of great people, and the pay is actually pretty good. You can have a pretty good lifestyle depending on.
Wouldn't you, just to push that a little bit further, wouldn't you say there's probably some correlation with advertisement, with graphic design, obviously, and like, storytelling through, the way something is presented or told to the market?
Yeah, for sure. There is definite creative side, and that's the only way I've been able to sort of put up with it for so long, that I get to express some sort of creativity. And it does allow me still to be able to come home and do my own work. I'm not so burnt out, thankfully, at the end of the day, that I can't come home and still make things on my own. So it has afforded me that opportunity to still be creative. And it's actually kind of reinforced some creative skills in myself, work ethic, always just managing to find time to think and to come up with ideas, even though you're maybe tired. And, it helps with communication as well. I do make presentations to clients and stuff. So that helps when I'm in an avenue where I need to sort of sell myself and talk about my artwork as well. So I try to pull some positives from being in that industry.
Yeah, totally. What, just to hit on something you just said was, the balancing act of, working a full-time job and then being a creative at night. And so a lot of the people who listen to this are creatives who have a full-time job, and then usually have some sort of inkling of, maybe it's not a full side hustle where they've monetized it or anything, but they have some sort of hobby that they're pursuing, right? And the question I get asked all the time is about creative burnout. And so you just hinted at that. But like, I'd like for you to expand on some of maybe, a tip or a trick that you've learned over the years of how do you balance that? Do you believe in like complete balance, work-life balance, or creative balance, or some of the things that you can kind of help people understand with how you've gotten through that, at least?
Yeah, I mean, burnout's definitely real. And I think that one way that I personally deal with it is just recognizing it, and just, there are times where I just rest. I'm like, I'm not worrying about making anything this week. At the end of the year, December tends to be pretty busy because I'll do craft fairs and things as well. And, so that's a grind where you're working a week, and then you're spending a weekend, hustling and talking to people and trying to, move some product and stuff, setting up, breaking down, you're shipping out orders and things like that. So typically for me, I'll take January off and just chill, relax, play video games,
Cool.
eat lots of Christmas cookies and things like that. I'm still working my 9 to 5, but I'm not worried about like making any new art during January. I'm just like, I got to relax. I got to recharge. I got to catch up on some comic books and just get re-inspired and not worry about making stuff. You just got to rest, you got to rest your spirit and your mind and all those things. So
you do that for an entire I've never heard somebody put it like that. And that works. You do that year over year?
I try to make a goal of just like, I'm not going to worry about making stuff. selling stuff, hustling. I'm not going to worry too much about, posting. I'll post here and there maybe, but I'm just like, I'm like, I got to rest. I got to rest. And it ends up being, probably about that third week, you know, and I start to get antsy a little bit and start, sketching and drawing and whatnot, but I don't put any pressure on myself that month. I just try to
But
be easy.
I think that's a huge takeaway is like you set aside, like you've already programmed it in your brain. Like this is my month to rest. Like I know it's coming. It's after the holiday season and it's kickstarting my entire year, like
Yeah.
creatively.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and obviously I still take breaks in there, there might be like, there might be a push where I've got a show coming up or something and I'm really grinding out that last month. And then I'll take like a week off or something, after I finish those pieces, the show goes up or whatever. And I think it's just, you shouldn't feel guilty about not making something for a few days, and I think a lot of people do. There's this sort of thing in like social media about like the constant grind, 24/7, always grinding, but you got to rest. You just do.
Yeah, it's definitely important. Obviously, creative burnout, as you said, is super real and it happens, and people just have to be a little bit self-aware. How long have you been doing this quote unquote side hustle, this creative side hustle of yours? Like, because you mentioned, after you graduated, you get a job in advertising, and it sounds like you're still doing that. You know, from college, have you always been selling art, or like when did that actually start for you?
Yeah, yeah. So, in college, I actually had started out in graphic design, and then I happened to run into the head of the illustration department outside of school. I happened to be working with his wife, and so she introduced us, and he actually pulled me into illustration because I had kind of assumed naively that being in art college that, I'm going to learn to paint, I'm going to learn all these things, but in graphic design, he was like, no, you're just going to learn stuff on the computer. So I moved over to illustration, but I was still into graphic design. Like I loved typography and things like that. So I minored in graphic design. And, I kind of wanted to be a fine art illustrator. And, I didn't really see myself doing editorial illustration and thing like that, but I loved, illustration itself. And I think my style lent itself to that because I came from a love of comics. So my style was very line driven and graphic. So even right out of college, I was looking for gallery shows and trying to get into group shows and sending stuff out to galleries and going around town and trying to get into what galleries were here. And I would get into, one or two shows here, some local stuff. And then slowly I got the courage to hit up bigger galleries or built up more of a network and things like that. So it's always been a grind since I graduated college. I think that was probably '05 is when I was done with college.
What from your perspective drives you to do that? Is it just like this creative itch of yours to do it on the side, or like is part of you, is it driven by money, or is it really just like a passion of yours?
I think for me, being a little kid and being into arts, I knew what an artist was, and that idea of being an artist where you make a painting and you sell it and you live off of that, has always been sort of the end goal for me. And that's always what drives me is, my goal is to leave advertising and live 100% off of my art, whatever it is that may be, whether it's, selling comic books or selling paintings or selling, even t-shirts and things like that. And, these crafts that I make, because I'm into so many different things, but the goal is to be, a quote unquote artist that lives off of their own art 100%.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, if you ask most artists, it seems like even probably until Clubhouse started, like this year, like when I started religiously doing it, I always like had this, and I've only been painting for the past couple of years, so I'm like fairly new to it in the scheme of things as well. I was so naive. I was like, oh, all these like 40,000, 100,000, following artists like do this full time. And like, that's not the case. Like
No. No. Yeah. It is funny when you realize that, because I learned that, you know, not recently, like within the last couple of years, but I'd say recently, like within the last decade or so, that the majority of artists you see out there, aren't working full time as an artist. Obviously you've got your, God, I can't even think of anybody's name right now, but you've got your James Jeans out there. and your causes out there and stuff. And those guys, those guys are like the Michael Jordans of the industry, so they're not,
Totally.
they're
Yeah,
not
no,
working in
they're definitely rarities, and then there's like a massive drop off from the blue chip artist to like the next tier. It's like a massive gap.
Yeah. I mean, there's your Michael Jordans, and then there's your people that are in the NBA that are doing pretty good, because one thing that was interesting after college that I think really exploded, or maybe I learned more about, is that there's a wide swath of artists that make a decent living off of their art, and there's so many more avenues to sell your creativity, than what's just sort of taught to you in school. Especially in illustration, it's like, oh, you can work in editorial, or maybe you can do books and things like that, or maybe you get into comics. But there's so many other things out there now, because there's a lot more tools available for artists just to make stuff. Now we've got 3D printing. Artists can get their own printers. Getting prints made is a lot cheaper. There's so many more fairs, comic fairs, craft fairs, custom design toy fairs. You've got Complex Con, all that, Designer Con, all this stuff. And there was a lot of artists that grinded out and they're hitting that craft fair circuit, and just traveling all over the US. And, it's a grind, because I've done it. I only do, maybe 3 craft fairs a year. And even that's a grind. But I know some that are hitting stuff, 10 months out of the year.
So you've learned over the years kind of that balancing act of how far you want to push that hustle, amongst other things in life. I'm assuming, because it sounds like if you're doing 2 or 3, you're not trying to do 10 to 12 a year, and eventually, that one of those opportunities is going to give you that break to quit your job, or are you just taking more of a strategic approach to it?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it strategic. I think it's kind of just like learning as I go. Cool. And, finding out exactly how much I can do, and then, just maintaining a work-life balance. I think if I was single and younger, I would probably be trying to grind that out. But, I'm in my mid 40s. I'm married. I got 2 dogs. And I don't want to be staying up till 2 or 3 in the morning anymore. Like I do it, when I'm working on shows, when I'm painting, or, sometimes I just got a painting I want to get out or whatnot, but I can't do that 5, 6, 7 nights a week like I used to, man. It's just not healthy.
Yeah.
And so I think to your point, I do have to be more strategic with my time. And, I can only pour so many hours into one thing. And I'm probably pulling back on the craft fair thing. I'm probably not going to be doing that too much, because it's a lot of time spent doing stuff that in my head, I'm like, I'd rather be painting.
Right. So you mentioned, and you hit on this a little bit earlier, you mentioned the gallery side of things, and my understanding, or even my experience in the art world, or even my perception before I really started learning and educating myself about it, is getting into galleries is like this majestic thing, and it's very difficult, and it's very, prestigious and all this stuff. And then I look at your website and you have this slew of galleries that you've been in, which is pretty remarkable, right? Talk about the process of those, and why you want to be in a gallery, and what the benefit for artists is, or is it even necessary these days, because there's so many other platforms that you can share work, like TikTok or Instagram or, Etsy or whatever it is. Like, is it still valuable, and is it as prestigious as maybe I or other people perceive it to be?
I still think it's super prestigious. That's always been my goal. And there's definitely sort of, from the outside looking in, there is a cache it of like, oh, you've been in art galleries in New York, or you've been in art galleries in, LA. When you tell people that, they sort of, there's more of a I think, a respect put on you as an artist. And so for me, that's always been the goal and a dream. And I remember, getting into some of these early gallery shows and really feeling like, oh, okay, I made it, but I think, to go back to the NBA reference again, it's like there's getting into the NBA, and then there's getting to the playoffs, and I think that, maybe I'm on the bench in the NBA, and I haven't quite gotten a lot of play time yet, and I certainly haven't been to the playoffs, but that's what I'm, training for every day.
So you still have ambitions and goals to like get into even higher tiered galleries and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just the thing that I'm learning with me specifically, is that there's getting a gallery show and getting into a group show maybe, or even getting a solo show. And then there's the consistency of it all, of year after year of getting work out there into these bigger galleries, maybe getting into some of these big art festivals, uh, you know, that are around the world, out in LA or out in Florida and things like that, like Art Basel. Never even been close to Art Basel. But one thing that comes with getting in some of those galleries and then possibly getting represented by a bigger gallery is that they're out there networking for you and pushing your artwork for you. And for me, that's sort of the goal, because I don't necessarily want to spend that much time schmoozing. Like I want to be here where you see me, like just painting and making stuff, and I don't mind, if I'm at an opening, like talking and sharing, talking about my work and sharing stories and things like that. Like I do enjoy that aspect, but I don't want to be knocking on doors, to galleries and stuff all the time. I want to get, in with a gallery or two galleries and stuff and get some good representation so that I can just kick back and make work all day.
Yeah, totally. And I think that comes down to the artist. Like, do they want to spend the time creating and maximize their actual skill set, or do they want to balance that out with the talking, the schmoozing, the going, knocking door to door hustle, or leverage somebody else to do that on your behalf when they already have a reputation in that space? So it sounds like there's pros and cons to that.
Yeah, there is for sure. And every artist, I think, finds their balance. Like some artists are good at that. They can get out and schmooze and really sell themselves. And I'm okay at it, like I'm comfortable doing it when I'm doing it. But I'm always like that kind of nerdy kid at the dance. I never want to ask for the first dance, but if I can ever
once
get over
everybody's
that,
dancing.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
But once I'm dancing, I'm good. So
yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
You mentioned solo shows, and to me, I think that's probably and this is just my opinion, it's one of the coolest things I think that somebody could do, and it's an ambition of mine to hold a solo show. What does that entail, or from your perspective, have yours been successful? Into like, what is that is that up to your standards, or is it somebody else's standards? Like what goes into something like that? Or is it just like a years long of work, or is it a lifetime of work, or can it be all of the above?
I think, I've had solo shows, but not at major galleries, just like smaller galleries or, warehouse galleries, basement galleries, things like that, where I've shown, it's been a quote unquote solo show, but it hasn't been, something that anyone's really gonna know too much about outside of a small circle. In a way, like I think I would imagine if I was to get a big solo show at like, say, Think Space or something like that, or maybe Rock LaRue or whatever, that to me will sort of feel like a lifetime of work. It's almost like when a band gets signed and they put out their first album, it's like that first album is 20 years of work, and then you got to cut that next album a year or two later, so that first big solo show will be like a lifetime's worth of work, but then physically it's work I probably would have created within the last year or so.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's cool. Let's talk about the actual art, right? And because it's super vibrant. Like that's the word I kept thinking about when trying to like describe it. And obviously doing some research, you use the term mythography to describe your work. So one, can you define that for us? Because I don't think I could put a definition to it. And then two, talk about like your inspiration behind the colors and the proportions and the themes of your work.
Yeah. So first off, mythography is basically a simple definition of it is the visual representation of myths. And myths are something, coming from a world of comic books, myths are something I'm super interested in. And I was raised Catholic, and I'm not practicing anymore, but I look at like those biblical stories as myths themselves, and those are superhero stories, things like that. So I think that informs a lot of my love of myths. And then as a kid, I was super into Egyptian mythology. I think a lot of kids go through a period where they're into like Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology and things like that. And, in Greek mythology, learning about Thor and Hercules and all this stuff, like that was fascinating to me. And so all that has sort of built within me just a love of myths. And, comic books build up off of a lot of mythology, these superheroes and these great powers and these great adventures and the battle between good and evil. So all of that informs the sort of story behind my work, which is very character driven. And then I think the colors come from, I've been in the past few years really diving deeply into more of my own culture, which is Latin American culture. Both my parents are Mexican. So I kind of spent a lot of time around these bright, bold, vivid colors from my culture, but it was something that I didn't really look to as inspiration until I think the last several years, where I've made a conscious effort to like pull color palettes from, things like Mexican pottery, Mexican blankets, Mexican fashion, Native American fashion, and looking at those things and using them to inform my work more. So that's where that very intentional, vivid color palette comes from.
Do you see that phasing out or transitioning out, or do you like, is this a one-time kind of collection that you're absorbing right now and you're gonna see where it goes, or is that an ever-changing progression, or do you see it being forever in your work?
I can't say I look that far ahead.
Okay.
And so I will be kind of on that path for as long as I feel inspired to do it.
Cool.
I enjoy doing it, and one thing I really love doing is playing with color combinations. I'm always on the computer mapping out colors for my paintings and experimenting and doing color variations. And so I see myself sticking with that for quite a while, because it's just something that I really do enjoy doing.
So I'm gonna push on that a little bit further, right? Like, talk about your process, because you just talked about doing color combinations on a computer or whatever. You can draw by hand, you can paint, you can obviously do digital work. So is your process consistent across the mediums, or do you have a specific process for painting, and then for digital art, is it different? Is it the same? Kind of talking about your step by step.
Yeah, typically my work always starts digitally nowadays. I'm working on Procreate on an iPad Pro, and I'm doing some sketches, and I still do work in a very traditional way, where when I do a sketch, I'll do what's called like a blue line, which is taken from kind of the comic book world, where you would actually draw with a blue line that doesn't reproduce. So you could draw and ink over that blue line, and then they could print it. They could scan it in and print it in, but that blue isn't going to pick up. So I'm actually still, even though it doesn't need to be done digitally for whatever reason, that's my habit. And then I'm inking in Procreate, and I'll kind of toggle back and forth between Photoshop and Procreate, building up layers. So I'll have a layer with just my line work on it, and then I'll have a layer with all my colors on it, and then I'll have a layer with my background elements. I'll have a layer with my painted elements in there, and then from there, I'll basically get like a 100% finished piece, and it's probably like 90 to 100% finished. And then I'll print out my line work, and then I'll trace it down onto my canvas, whatever size that may be. Typically, I'm doing 16 by 20, but I'll do. Recently, I finished some 4 foot by 2 foot commissions. But so I'll just trace my line work down, and then I'll just get to painting. So some things I do, I'll end up just I want to print this out, but other things I'll for whatever reason I want to paint certain pieces.
So it's fairly methodical. Like, it doesn't sound like you do a ton of like wicked abstract work or anything like that.
No. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's purposeful? Have you like tried to do abstract? Because the reason why I ask is like my painting started with me trying to find a second job teaching art classes at one of those wine bars, which is very comical. But then I started doing sneaker paintings, which were super like realistic or semi-realistic, I guess you could say. There's still a lot of work to be done. But then I've recently been trying more abstract work, and it's a completely different practice. Like you have to eliminate a lot of the preset kind of stage gates in the way that you would approach the work. But to me, it's fun learning that process, then figuring out which one I like the most, and then going after that. But have you experimented in that, or have you just kind of gravitated towards more of this kind of step-by-step process?
I have experimented in it, but I've worked sort of streamlining my process and really nailing it down. Mainly just because it helps me work faster, and it helps me sort of disappear into my work quicker. I don't want to spend a lot of time figuring things out while I'm painting, because I want to just be getting it done, and I want to get the painting complete because I want to do another painting and another painting. That's not to say that I don't make space for happy accidents, and I do experiment, but I tend to experiment with different things. So sometimes I might go like I took a class on how to make shoes. So I made my own pair of shoes just
Nice.
because I wanted to do something else. And that is another way that I kind of stay fresh and keep free of burnout as well, is just like learning a new skill. Right now I'm learning, I just got a new app for my iPad. So I'm playing with 3D and learning 3D because I want to get to sculpting and maybe get into 3D printing some of my characters and things like that.
That's awesome. Like what kind of app is it?
It's called Forger,
Oh, nice.
Forger. And again, it's some of the tools that are available to artists nowadays are so amazing, and they're so cheap and plentiful. So it's a great time to be alive with all this stuff that's right at our fingertips. I mean, it's amazing. Like 3D printers are, they're affordable. You can get a decent 3D printer for a few $100. I mean, it's amazing. That's just like, that's like Star Trek stuff to me.
Yeah, we've made a lot of progress, and I love the saying, it's a great time to be alive. I think it's the best time to be alive. I think anything is possible in 2021, especially now post-pandemic, or getting out of the pandemic, if you would.
Yeah.
Really, there's no reason, unless you're going to build excuses for yourself, because everything is at our fingertips.
Yeah, man. I mean, just the greatest enemy right now is time. It's just, there's not enough time in the day for me to do and make all the stuff I want to do. Not enough time for me to do it and be on Clubhouse. But yeah, I mean, that's always what I'm battling against. It's just finding the time to make and do all the things I want to do.
Yeah, I want to touch on one thing that I found consistent in at least your Instagram. It was this story or sharing of, you titled it "Nevertheless, She Persisted," and I think it was super cool because you were storytelling or highlighting different women of different backgrounds and kind of their stories to your audience, which a lot of times artists contemplate, or they'll ask questions of like, should I have a separate Instagram for my art? Like, is it different than my personal life? Is it, should it be different than my other craft or hobby? And like, what do I share? What don't I share? And you've been consistent with this, of like sharing these kind of programs or stories of these women, which you're a male artist. So like provide some context as to like why you do that and kind of the purpose.
Yeah. When I do, I tend to work like in a series of series. So I'll focus on a subject matter or something for a while, and then that series, for whatever reason, will kind of run its course. And that was just kind of a side project I was doing. It was just kind of, I wanted to protest in a way, and I think people that want to protest, not everyone goes out and marches, because that's just maybe not their thing, or maybe they're uncomfortable with it or whatnot. But so that was sort of just me trying to protest back then, and shine light on, I think, a lot of women that need to have light shined on them, and telling stories about these sort of hidden heroes, or maybe invisible heroes, and things like that. And that, of course, rose up after the story, in the political realm, And so I wanted to take that phrase, and it was kind of this little spat between Elizabeth Warren and Mitch McConnell, and I wanted to focus on what Elizabeth was doing, and shine a light on what I think a lot of women are doing, which is just being awesome. So that was a small series I did. And yeah, it is funny because I will kind of go back in my Instagram and try to clear out stuff so that it is more focused on just my paintings and whatnot. But I don't got time to dig that far back and delete everything, so that's still up there.
Yeah, you'll leave it up to the random guy podcast hosting.
Yeah.
No, but I thought it was super cool and it was different, right? It wasn't because I think sharing just art is great, but I find that a lot of people actually want to know who's behind the art and what, sometimes what they stand for or what their initiatives or what their motives are. And I thought it was really incredible that you would do something like that. So I wanted to make sure that I shared that story, or at least you talked about it for a couple minutes, because it is unique. It was a different perspective. Not everybody does stuff like that.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing it up. And one thing that to me personally for that is that what was fun for me was to research all of these women and find their stories, and that to me is learning a new thing that I can inform into the mythology of my own characters. So I'm learning about what these women have done, and I can use that to build characters in my world too. So it's always sort of there's a selfish act to it too, because I'm using it to learn, and hopefully these characters can sort of stand on the shoulders of real heroes.
Totally. That's super cool. What's next? You mentioned like your consistent efforts in learning new things, obviously. The easy question that I'm going to ask you, and it seems to be repetitive over the past, 10 episodes on here. Are you getting into NFTs? Is that why you're on Clubhouse? You do digital art as it is. Is that a natural progression for you to learn about and try to experiment with? Talk about kind of your frame of mind with that world.
Sure. Yeah. I kind of just got a random invite from like a friend of my wife's. Like I didn't really even know too much about it. Like I'd heard Clubhouse. I was like, I don't need that shit. But I got the invite, so I tried it out, and I stumbled into some really good rooms. I'm mainly like this low-bar art room, but I'm in some animation rooms and things like that. And I think in its core sense, it was just having someone else to talk to, and it's nice to go into rooms and just have someone to talk to, or even just someone to listen to, and it kind of just made some of those nights painting a little bit less lonelier. And then, you're making friends too. So I'm talking to friends that I would maybe only just text with on Instagram or just text, through the phone or whatever. So I'm talking to, people I know from Guam, people I know from LA, and then even friends that I know from here in Detroit too. So, from there, I did get into some NFTs and learned all about that. So yeah, I'm posting stuff on Hickek Nuct now and then. We'll see how much longer it goes. It's another avenue to be creative in. So I'm just trying to treat it as something fun and not necessarily a big money making opportunity right now.
Yeah, I think that's super important, and just learning that I don't think it's going away. And so just immersing yourself in the culture, understanding what's work, what's not, experimenting, having some fun with it. And to your point, not necessarily going after the money grab. I think that whole wave is done. And now it's submerged itself, and now people can focus on the actual craft and building an audience in the metaverse.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, that stuff, I actually find that fascinating. Like this idea of building a whole world where people can come in and see that, like that's super interesting to me. And I wanna explore that more and do that. But again, like I said earlier, the biggest enemy is time, and we'll see how much time I got to put into that.
It's the truth. Time is the thing that we value the most, and we have the least of, it seems like. What, in terms of maybe even outside of NFTs and things like that, like do you have initiatives or goals, maybe short term and then long term? Obviously you hinted, I guess, on the long term of like being a self-sustained artist and being able to quit your job. But let me ask you a different form of that question. Like, do you have like a business plan or anything to get there, or, are you just winging it?
I do need a business plan, but what I do is I kind of operate. I try to set like short-term goals that hopefully get me to my long-term goals. So I had talked with some other creatives and stuff in terms of kind of finding some longer term goals or finding ways to get to those longer term goals. And I think what I'm going to do is I spend a lot of time making characters, but I don't spend a lot of time with those characters. I might do a painting and then I move on to the next painting, and then I do that painting and then I move on to the next one. But what I'm going to try to focus on doing is sort of building out more stories of those characters and building out the world more. So maybe doing a painting of the same character a few different times, or I want to do some like printed materials. So sort of like maybe doing sort of like a comic in a sense, but it's just deeper, longer stories about these characters. And that's, kind of, it's in between a comic and a book in that it's very word heavy and less image heavy, but you're going to have like an image on every page, and maybe I tell a longer form story about this specific character.
That's awesome. I hope to see that in the near future. I think that way you can really combine your love for comics and what you're currently doing. Isn't it amazing that like the older you get, and just for context, I'm 29, but like I find myself even now like resorting back to the things I loved as a child and trying to immerse myself in those things versus like getting bogged down of like what people as you grow up tell you to do as a grown up, and then like actually realizing that sucks and like let's go back in time to like what we did as children.
Yeah, no, it's definitely like that's sort of my it's almost like spiritual thumb sucking, like comic books are my sort of safety blanket, and I can go back and disappear into that world and let my imagination roam and learn more about the adventures of all these characters. And I'm still a Spider-Man fan. I still read all that Marvel stuff, but I'm really into like alternative comics, and I read a lot of I try to find like French artists and things like that in Europe, comics are much more respected. There's something that is seen as an art form in of itself, and it's not just this thing that's just for kids. So for me, like everything for me starts in that world of comic books and stuff. So when I can go back and just sit down and read and disappear into comics, that's my it's my safety blanket.
Yeah, I love that. Before I ask you my last question, where can people find you? Where are you most reachable? What are your handles, websites, anything you want to kind of give people to try to follow along with your journey?
Yeah. So real quick, so you hit on this at the beginning that when you opened up Zoom, it said Mark Moreno, but at the name I give you is Mark Sarmel. Yeah. So Mark Moreno is a very common name. And so when I was graduating college, I was like, if someone's going to find me on Google, they're going to have to like dig down in these pages. So I needed to come up with a pseudonym of sorts. So Sarmel is a made up word. I have two half sisters that live back in Texas that I don't get to see too much. And I've got another half sister that's out in Chicago that I don't get to see too much either. And then I've got another stepsister, but the two sisters I grew up with are named Sarah and Melissa. So Sar from Sarah, Mel from Melissa. So I just made that up as sort of a nod to them to let them know that I love them and I miss them. So that's where that name comes from. So along with that, lucky enough, there aren't many Sarmels out there since it's made up. So you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Mark Sarmel. My website is Mark Sarmel. I think there's a Mark Sarmel Tumblr that's still out there somewhere, I think. MySpace is out there too somewhere. I haven't updated.
Is that how you present yourself in galleries and things like that?
Say that again?
Is that how you present yourself in galleries and things like that?
Yeah, I do. But I'm pretty straightforward. Like on my website, it says,
Yep.
Mark Monroe is my real name and things like that. So it's not like something I try to hide or cover. It's just, sometimes I was in another interview and the interviewer kind of said that that's my secret identity too. So I like that.
Yeah, that we could get into a whole different conversation of, should artists have aliases and stuff. I've been in a clubhouse room with that, and I love both sides, but no, I think it's cool that you're transparent about that, and I think the story behind the made up name is even better. So thanks for sharing that. I think that's great.
Yeah.
I'll make sure. So I'm not your first podcast, I'm assuming, based on you saying you just did another interview.
I've been like a couple small ones, but this was, this was like a few years ago, and it was like a friend of a friend was trying to launch their podcast series. So I've done, I think this is maybe my third one. So
Okay. Okay. I'm
yeah,
still
lucky number three.
early on. I like that.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
try to catch people early because on their meteoric rise, I want to make sure that I got to say that I caught them at the ground floor. So,
Well, I
um,
hope this is blast off.
exactly. That's right. My last question is, if you had to leave other creatives or anyone listening a piece of advice that you've learned along your way or your journey, what's something that you would transpire back out there as a golden nugget or an inspiration token, or just advice in general to people?
Um, I think just do your best to be true to yourself. Um, there's a lot of things that will push and pull you in other directions, but um, just do your best to be your own honest, true self, and make things that ultimately you enjoy making. You know, um, and then just find the time to do that. Yeah.
I love that. I mean, be yourself, right? Society wants us to be something we're not, and you ultimately got to come back to yourself. So that's amazing. I think that's a great way to end the episode. Mark, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story on episode 40 of An Untold Narrative.
Thank you. Thanks so much.